A fifth-floor apartment in Paris, in the second week of August 2003. The window has been open since 6 in the morning, because it felt cool then, and it still feels cool at 8. By 11, the wall behind the radiator reads 42 degrees Celsius. By 2 in the afternoon, the air inside is hotter than the air outside, and nobody opens the window again, because nobody comes in. The woman who lives here is 81. She has not sweated in 6 hours. By the time her son finds her, the bedroom thermometer reads 34.1. He had called the day before. She had said she was fine. That single apartment is one of 15,000 counted by the French National Statistics Office, INSEE, in the 18-day window between August 1st and August 18th, 2003. Most above the 3rd floor, most with the window open at the wrong time of day. The heat wave killed more people in those 18 days than the entire French winter killed that year. Heat does not work the way the news cycle says it works. The afternoon peak is the headline. The afternoon peak is not the killer. The killer is the accumulation. 3 consecutive nights when the temperature in a sealed apartment never drops below 26 degrees. And the cardiovascular system never gets the 4-hour cool window it needs to repair the previous day's damage. By night 4, the body cannot cool itself. The heart does the work the building was supposed to do, and the heart runs out of margin first. That is how heat actually kills you. Slowly, across a week, in your own bedroom. I spent 13 years on heat distribution and substation load. Berlin, Magdeburg, the Lusatian power belt with the brown coal blocks used to anchor the eastern grid. Every summer the same calls. A 1970s Plattenbau in Marzahn, with a 7th floor reading at midnight was still 29 degrees Celsius. A Wilhelmstil Altbau in Charlottenburg with 8-meter ceilings, where the heat sank into the parquet floor and stayed there into October. A Magdeburg block with a south-facing facade reached 51 degrees on the brick at 4 in the afternoon. And 3 nights later, the resident on the top floor stopped answering the door. Every summer, the same 3 mistakes inside the apartments. None of them about gear. None of them about money. All of them about how the building works as a system and how the body works inside it. The building is a thermal battery. The body is a heat engine inside that battery. When the battery overcharges, the engine cooks. That is the whole substrate. Here is the engineering reality. A panel block from the 1970s, a tall-ceilinged pre-war building, a modern townhouse with thin insulation. All 3 behave the same way under prolonged heat. They store.
Notice the brick resistance here at
anywhere from 300 to 800 kilojoules of thermal energy per square meter of wall mass, released slowly with a lag of 4 to 10 hours behind outside temperature. The Plattenbau exterior panel, about 20 centimeters of poured concrete with mineral wool sandwiched in, stores roughly 600 kilojoules per square meter and releases that load with a 6 to 8 hour lag. The Altbau brick wall, 45 centimeters of solid masonry, no insulation, stores closer to 900 but releases over 10 to 12 hours, which is why those apartments stay warm longer into the night but also recover slower in the morning. The modern thin-shell townhouse stores less but radiates fast, so the spike comes early and sharp. Different storage profiles, same failure mode if you misread the timing. That lag is what kills you. The wall that absorbed sun at 1 in the afternoon is releasing that heat into your sleeping body at midnight, not as a problem you can feel coming. As a slow rise, nobody notices until the thermometer at the headboard says 28, and the second night begins. 3 mistakes, all intuitive, all wrong, all about timing. Mistake 1, The morning window. The temperature outside drops overnight. The early air feels cool. So you open the window, you make coffee, you leave it open while you shower, while you check your phone, while the kettle boils. Sometime between 8 and 10, the outside air crosses the inside air and keeps climbing. You do not notice the crossover because the temperature in the room only catches up about 90 minutes later. By the time you close the window, if you close it, the wall has already absorbed the heat you let in. The cool reservoir you built overnight is gone. You spent it on coffee. Take a real Berlin July day. Outside at 6 a.m., 18 degrees Celsius. Inside the bedroom at 6 a.m., 23. The gradient is 5 degrees in your favor. You should cross-ventilate hard. Outside at 9 a.m., 23 degrees. Inside, still 23. The gradient is gone. Outside at 10 a.m., 26. Inside, 23.5 and rising on a delayed curve. You have already given the room and the walls back 200 kilojoules of heat that you spent the previous night losing. By noon, outside reads 31, and your bedroom wall, which finished the night at 20.5, is now climbing through 26, on its way to 29. You will not get that overnight reservoir back until the next midnight at the earliest. That is the cost of leaving the window open while the kettle boiled. The correction is timing, not effort. Cross-ventilation, hard, 10 to 20 minutes, at 6 in the morning. Windows on opposite sides of the apartment open at the same time. Every interior door open. Push the air through. Then close everything, hermetically. Shutters down, blinds drawn. If you have external shutters, the metal or wood kind, that close on the outside of the glass, they block up to 70% of solar radiation before the photon hits the pane. That is the only number that matters. Once radiation crosses the glass, it has already deposited heat on your floor and your walls. External shutters block. Internal curtains slow. If you do not have external shutters, the substitute is reflective film on the inside of the glass. An emergency mylar blanket from a hardware store, cut to the window frame, shiny side facing outward. The film reflects roughly half of the incoming infrared. It also traps heat against the pane, so leave a finger-width air gap between film and glass, or the pane cracks from differential thermal expansion. The fix costs €3. The mistake costs the window. And then the apartment stays closed. All day. Not let it breathe at noon. Closed. The hotter it is outside, the less air you exchange. You are sealing, not ventilating. Every air exchange after the morning window costs you stored cool. Mistake 2. The cold shower. The ice water. The frozen beer that feels like the answer at 3 in the afternoon. The skin meets cold. The capillaries in the surface tissue clamp shut in less than a second. The hypothalamus, the body's thermostat, the size of an almond, sitting behind your eyes, reads the sudden surface drop and does what evolution wrote into it. It shuts down the sweat. It believes you are freezing. So it stops the one process actually cooling your core. 40 minutes later, the core temperature spikes higher than before the shower. You feel sick. You feel dizzy. You feel like you need another cold shower. That is the loop that kills people in their own bathrooms during a heat wave. The water you actually want is 22 to 26 degrees Celsius. Lukewarm. The kind of shower that feels uncomfortable because it does not feel like relief. The job of the shower is to wet the skin, not to shock it. Wet skin evaporates. Evaporation cools by physics. About 2,400 kilojoules per liter of water evaporated. That is more cooling than 2 adult bodies generate as metabolic heat, over 6 hours of sitting still. Do not towel off. Get out wet. Walk wet. Sit wet. Your skin is a wet surface for the next 20 minutes. Use it. A wet towel draped across the back of the neck does the same job at a smaller scale. Damp, not iced. The carotid artery passes about a centimeter below the skin on the side of the neck. The wet towel cools the air. The air cools the towel. The towel cools the artery. The artery cools the blood that runs to the brain. That is the order of operations. You're not chilling the skin. You're chilling the blood that goes to the part of the brain that decides whether you are about to faint. Electrolytes matter more than water. You can drink 3 liters of plain water in a heat wave and end up worse, because every liter of sweat takes about 3 grams of sodium with it, and pure water without salt dilutes what is left in the bloodstream. The medical name is hyponatremia. The symptoms look like heat stroke because at the level of the brain they are. Thermoregulation does not work without sodium. Salted broth, lightly salted soup, a glass of water with a pinch of sea salt and a squeeze of citrus. Oral rehydration salts from any pharmacy. No protein-heavy meals. Protein metabolism generates extra heat. No coffee. Caffeine is a mild diuretic. No alcohol. Alcohol dilates the surface vessels and lies to the brain about cooling while accelerating dehydration. The cold beer is the worst single drink in a heat wave. It feels like the answer. It is the trap. If you have watched a system fail and known something was wrong before anyone else did, this channel is built for that view, the system view, not the gear list. The rest of these videos walk through the things you saw and did not have a name for. Now the engineering side of cooling without electricity. The wet sheet on the window. The folk version of this trick has been around for 100 years. The physics under it is enthalpy of vaporization, the energy water absorbs when it changes phase from liquid to vapor. 2,257 kilojoules per kilogram at standard pressure. A bedsheet, soaked through so it drips, hung in front of a partially open window on the shaded side of the apartment, with a small battery-powered fan pushing room air through it. That sheet, over 6 hours, will pull between 2,400 and 3,600 kilojoules of heat energy out of the room as it evaporates 1 liter of water. That is more than the metabolic heat of 2 adults sitting still in the same room over the same 6 hours. You have built a passive heat exchanger out of fabric and water. The shaded side matters because direct sun on the wet sheet evaporates the water into the outside air without pulling heat from the room. You just dry your sheet. The shaded side, with a fan pulling room air through the wet fabric, draws the latent heat from inside and dumps the vapor outside. Re-wet whenever the sheet stops dripping. Work it through for a standard bedroom. 20 square meters of floor, 2.5-meter ceiling, 50 cubic meters of air. At 28 degrees Celsius and 40% relative humidity, that air holds roughly 1.5 megajoules of sensible heat above your target of 24. A liter of water evaporated through the sheet pulls about 2.3 megajoules. Mass balance says 1 well-managed wet sheet, kept dripping wet for 6 hours, drops a bedroom of that size by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, assuming the windows are sealed and the wall radiation is steady. 2 liters of evaporation over the night handles a 20 square meter bedroom, plus the metabolic heat of 2 adults. You need a fan moving the air across the sheet. You need a basin of water within reach for re-wetting. You do not need anything else. There is one condition under which this entire passive system fails. Wet bulb temperature. When the outside air's relative humidity climbs past about 80% at 35 degrees Celsius, the air is already nearly saturated, and water stops evaporating from any surface, including your skin. That is the threshold past which sweating no longer cools you. That is the threshold past which the wet sheet no longer cools the room. There is no passive cooling above wet bulb, 35 degrees Celsius. That is the number to track on a heat wave, not the dry bulb temperature on the news. The wet bulb you can calculate from any weather app that reports humidity. Above wet bulb 35, the only safe option is leaving the apartment for a building with mechanical cooling. Mistake 3. The 6 p.m. opening. You waited all day. The sun is dropping behind the building across the street. You open the window. You stand in front of it. The air feels still, but the heat coming through it is invisible to your skin. The asphalt below has been baking since noon. The concrete facade across the courtyard absorbed 8 hours of sunlight. Both are now radiating infrared at peak rate. 6 in the evening is the worst hour to open a window in a dense city, because radiative heating from urban hard surfaces peaks 2 to 3 hours after solar peak, out of the asphalt and into your own brick. The correction is to stop trusting how it feels and start measuring. 2 cheap household thermometers, 3 or 4 euros each. One outside, in continuous shade, on a north wall or under a balcony soffit. One inside at chest height, directly above the bed in the bedroom, because the bedroom is the room whose nighttime temperature determines whether you live through the heat wave. For 3 consecutive evenings, you write down both readings, every hour, from 6 p.m. through 2 a.m. After 3 days, you have a curve. You know your specific apartment's thermal lag. You know the exact hour when outside crosses below inside by at least 2 degrees Celsius. That is the only hour you open. In most city apartments above the 2nd floor, that hour is between midnight and 2 in the morning. Not 6, not 8, not 10. Midnight or later. The curve looks different in different buildings. That is the point of measuring, rather than guessing. A 4th-floor Altbau with thick brick walls and south exposure may not cross until 2 a.m. The brick is still radiating from the afternoon. A modern townhouse with thin shell construction may cross at 11 p.m. It dumps its heat fast. A Plattenbau north-facing apartment may cross at 10 p.m. Never exposed to direct sun, the panel cools quickly. The number on the news is the dry bulb temperature at the airport. The number on your headboard is the only number that determines what time tonight you open. 3 days of measurement, 20 minutes a night, and you have your apartment's signature for the rest of the summer. When you do open everything at once. Cross-ventilate, interior doors propped wide, fan in one window pulling air, the opposite window pulling room air toward it. 45 minutes of hard flow. Then close everything again at least 1 hour before sunrise, because radiative heating of east-facing surfaces begins before the sun is visible from your window. Close before the city heats up, not after. While you sleep, the apartment can be assisted with what we used to call radiator-style passive cooling. 6 liters of water frozen overnight in plastic bottles, old milk jugs, 2-liter soda bottles, anything food-safe with a screw cap, placed in the room before bed. 6 kilograms of ice absorbs approximately 2,000 kilojoules of heat as it melts. That is 2 adults' worth of overnight metabolic heat, handled by something you froze the day before. The bottles need to be in the air the fan moves. Stand the fan blowing across the bottles toward the bed, and you build a 1 to 2 degree drop within a meter of them, sustained for 4 to 6 hours. Enough to give the cardiovascular system its repair window. There is also the matter of where in the apartment you sleep. Hot air rises. If your apartment has multiple levels, sleep on the lowest one. If your flat is single level, The coolest surface in it is the tiled floor of the bathroom or the kitchen. That tile, against the concrete slab below, runs 4 to 7 degrees Celsius cooler than the bed. A folded blanket on the tile, 3 or 4 hours of sleep on it during the worst part of the night. That is not poverty, that is physics. The earth pulls heat from your back. Mattresses trap it. Where you put cold on the body matters more than how cold it is. The body cools the blood, not the skin. Ice on the palm of the hand chills the skin and feels like immediate relief, but the cooling stays in the palm. Ice on the wrist, where the radial artery runs about 2 millimeters under the skin. That cools the blood returning to the core. The pulse points are not symbolic. They are the locations where major vessels run close enough to the surface for surface cooling to reach the bloodstream within minutes. Inside of the wrists, sides of the neck along the carotid, inner crook of the elbows, backs of the knees, the femoral artery in the groin if you can tolerate it. Frozen water bottles wrapped in a thin cloth, rotated every 15 to 20 minutes between 2 of these points. You are cooling the river, not the bank. And that is where the design assumption breaks for most cold shower advice. The advice assumes you are cooling a surface. The body is cooling a fluid. The fluid is what reaches the brain. The surface is the entry point. So you choose entry points where the fluid runs close, you keep the contact long, and you keep the cold mild enough that the hypothalamus does not panic and shut the sweat down. Mild and sustained beats harsh and brief every time. For an older adult who cannot tolerate sudden cold, the same principle scales down. A damp, cool cloth on the inside of the wrist, refreshed every 10 minutes. Tepid water, not iced, to the back of the neck with a sponge. The hypothalamus does not panic at 15 degrees Celsius. It panics at 4. Mild and long beats, cold and short. The blood pulled from the radial vessels still gets cooler than it was. Over 20 minutes of contact, you have moved the same total quantity of heat as a brief ice application, without triggering the shutdown response that brief ice causes. With elderly patients in particular, the brief and cold approach often does more harm than no cooling at all. Long and tepid is the safer default. There is a separate threshold you watch for in older or chronically ill household members, the failure point where this is no longer a household problem. Confusion, disorientation. The person stops sweating despite obvious heat. The skin goes dry and red and hot to the touch. Body temperature climbs past 40 degrees Celsius, which is 104 Fahrenheit, on a household thermometer. That is heat stroke. That is not give them more water. That is an emergency. You call the local equivalent of 911, 112 in most of Europe, and while you wait, you move the person to the coolest surface in the apartment. You wet them down with tepid water, and you do not give them anything to drink if they are confused, because they can aspirate. The window for getting heat stroke treatment effective is short. Recognize it, act on it, do not negotiate with it. Hydration during a heat wave is not run on thirst. Thirst dulls with age. By 75, the perception of thirst lags about 4 hours behind actual dehydration. So you do not run hydration on feel. You run it on a timer. Every 45 minutes, 1 full glass of water, mixed with a pinch of salt, or with oral rehydration salts at the packet dose. Not gulped, sipped over 5 minutes. The urine should be pale yellow. Clear means too much water without salt. Amber means not enough. When the apartment systems and the body systems together are not enough, and there are days when they will not be, leave the apartment. Most municipalities maintain cooling centers during heat waves. Public libraries shopping centers, community halls, train stations. The address sits behind a phone number you have to look up, and it is best looked up before the heat wave, not during. Save it in a phone with the label cooling center. The most dangerous failure point in a heat wave is the moment a vulnerable person decides they will not be a bother and stays home with the window open. There is a 48-hour window before a forecast heat wave arrives, and what you do in that window determines most of the outcome. Freeze your 6 liters of water in bottles 2 days out. Buy a second cheap thermometer if you do not already have one. Cut the mylar to your window frame and leave it rolled on the sill. Stock 4 liters of bottled water per person, on the assumption that municipal supply may dip in pressure during peak demand. Test your fans. Identify your cooling center. And on the day before the wave hits, make the calls to anyone older than 75 in your contact list who lives alone. Not, "Are you ready for the heat?" That question gets a yes every time, because nobody wants to admit they are not ready. The question is, what time of day does your bedroom get warmest, and do you have a thermometer in it? That question reveals whether they have any idea what is coming. Which brings us to the part of all this that nobody puts in the brochure. Chicago, July 1995. 5 days of temperatures over 35 degrees Celsius. 739 excess deaths recorded by the city medical examiner. The single largest predictor of who lived and who died in those 5 days was not income. It was not housing quality. It was not the presence or absence of air conditioning. The sociologist Eric Klinenberg, working with the city records, mapped the deaths block by block. They clustered in neighborhoods where elderly residents lived alone and did not know the names of their neighbors. The neighborhoods next door, demographically nearly identical, had a fraction of the deaths. The difference was a knock on the door. Pull this apart, and you will see what is actually being measured. The substrate of that death count was not heat. It was silence. The body fails. There is no one in the room to notice it fails. The intervention that would have saved most of those lives is a single sentence. "I am going to come knock on your door at 3 p.m. for the next 4 days, and if you do not answer, I am calling the building manager." A neighbor pact. Mutual visual check, daily, for the length of the heat wave. That sentence is free. It does more than every fan I ever sold for a substation contractor. So if you have an older relative or neighbor, 75 and up, living above the 3rd floor, no air conditioning, no younger person in the building who knows their name, you walk this checklist with them, in their apartment, not over the phone. You go in, you look at their windows, you look at their thermometers, if they have any. You note what time of day the south wall starts radiating. You walk them through the 6 a.m. cross-ventilation and the noon seal and the midnight reopen. You leave them a handwritten card with the cooling center address and your phone number written in marker large enough to read without glasses. You set a daily check-in time. Predictable beats heroic in a heat wave, every time. The phone call itself is short, and the structure of it matters more than the warmth of it. You say what time you will call. You say what you will do if they do not answer. You call the building manager. You call the next-door neighbor whose number you also asked for. You come over. You do not leave it open-ended. "I'll check in sometime" is not a protocol. "I'll call you at 3. If you don't answer by 3:15, I'm calling the building manager. If they can't reach you, I'm in a taxi" is a protocol. Most older relatives will protest that this is too much. Most of them will then quietly write the time down on a piece of paper next to the phone. That paper is the most effective piece of preparedness equipment in the entire field. Here's what fails first when the rest of the system holds: the human link. The reason the 75 and up bracket is the majority of every heat wave death count in every European city since 2003 is not biology. The biology is solvable with what is already inside the apartment. The link to a second person, the one who notices the bedroom thermometer at 30, the one who refills the water glass without being asked, the one who knocks at 3 in the afternoon. That is what was missing. The fix is the cheapest single intervention in the entire field. It costs a phone call. It saves more lives per dollar than any cooling device on the market. What that means is the 3 mistakes you avoid in your own apartment are only half the work. The other half is the apartment you walk into next door, the bedroom you check at 3 p.m., the window you close for someone whose intuition is telling them it feels nicer with it open, the water glass you refill on the bedside table without being asked, the thermometer you tape above the bed because nobody else thought of it. That is the protocol, not a device. Before the next heat wave reaches your city, do this. Find the address of the nearest cooling center and write it on the inside of a cabinet door tonight. Buy 2 cheap thermometers if you do not already own them, one for outside in continuous shade, one for the bedroom directly above the bed. And pick the one elderly person you know best who lives alone, and tell them, in person, that you will be calling at 3 p.m. every day the temperature is over 32 degrees Celsius for the rest of the summer. You do not need a cooling system to keep a vulnerable person alive through a heat wave. You need an open window at 1 in the morning, a sealed wall at noon, and a phone call at 3 p.m. That does not get skipped. That last one is on you. Make it tonight.